"You need to learn your place," he sneered, abandoning me on that deserted highway. I felt a single tear escape, not of fear, but of absolute victory. Because his final act of cruelty was also my final, pre-planned move in a game he never knew we were playing. My name is Adriana, and this is the story of how my husband's final lesson became his final mistake. It started on a Thursday night in October. The rain wasn't just falling, it was attacking the windshield, a relentless assault of Pacific Northwest fury. Each swipe of the wipers barely cleared a patch of visibility before the world dissolved again into a blur of water and darkness. My husband Dominic pulled his Porsche Cayenne into a deserted rest stop 42 miles east of Seattle on I-90. The engine, a low, guttural hum, didn't even quiet. He turned to me, his face illuminated by the cold, sterile light of the dashboard. "Get out," he said, his voice as flat and hard as the asphalt outside. "You wanted to question my authority, Adriana. You wanted to know about my business. Fine. Here's your lesson. Maybe a 42-mile walk home in a storm will teach you some respect. Teach you your place." I didn't argue. I didn't cry. I just held his gaze for a moment, letting the tiny microphone on my coat lapel capture the timbre of his cruelty, the chilling lack of emotion. Then, I opened the door and stepped out into the tempest. I watched his taillights, twin red gashes in the blackness, shrink and then vanish around a curve. For a moment, there was only the sound of the wind screaming through the Cascade pines. A moment later, a pair of headlights cut through the rain. My brother Leo got out, holding a warm coat. I smiled as I slid into the passenger seat of his Jeep. Dominic's cruelty wasn't my punishment. It was his verdict, and I was about to be the judge, jury, and executioner. The plan hadn't started out of anger. It had started out of a quiet, creeping dread 9 months earlier. It began with the little things, the way Dominic would suddenly change his passwords, the hushed phone calls he'd take on the balcony overlooking Lake Sammamish, the way he'd belittle my financial background. I had an MBA from Stanford and managed a successful portfolio before we married, but he'd rewritten that history. To him, and to our friends, I was the woman he had saved from a mediocre career. He made me feel small, and for a while, I believed him. That's the most insidious part of control, isn't it? It doesn't always come with a raised voice. Sometimes it's a whisper that slowly erodes your reality. I'm sure some of you know exactly what that whisper sounds like. The first concrete proof was a credit card statement I found by accident, a charge for a suite at the Fairmont Olympic in downtown Seattle on a night he was supposedly on a red-eye to New York. The name on the room service bill wasn't mine. It was Sabrina's, his bright-eyed, ambitious new assistant. The infidelity was a shallow cut, painful but expected. The real wound, the one that triggered all of this, was on the next line. A wire transfer of $25,000 from our joint savings account to a numbered company I'd never heard of. That was the moment the fog of my carefully constructed life cleared. The man I married didn't just want a mistress, he wanted my future. He saw my signature not as a symbol of our partnership, but as a liability to be managed and eventually erased. He thought he was leaving me stranded in a storm. He had no idea I had been navigating this hurricane for months. As Leo handed me a thermos of hot coffee, the warmth spreading through my numb fingers, I took out my phone and sent a single text to a number saved under the name The Valkyrie. The text had only one word: precipitation. It was the signal. The first move in a war he didn't even know had been declared. His perfectly controlled world would begin to unravel at precisely 9 a.m. the next morning. "Did she reply?" Leo asked, his knuckles white on the steering wheel as he navigated the Jeep through the river of water that was once a highway. He didn't need to ask who she was. For the past 9 months, our lives had revolved around 3 key figures, a trinity of quiet power that Dominic had no idea existed. I glanced at my phone. A single checkmark appeared next to my text. Then another, delivered. A moment later, 3 words appeared on the screen from Victoria. "The storm is coming." Leo let out a breath he'd probably been holding since he got my initial signal. "It's really happening," he said, more a statement of awe than a question. I nodded, taking a sip of the coffee. It tasted like victory. It had started with Leo. 2 days after I found the wire transfer, I drove to his apartment in Fremont, the heart of Seattle's tech scene. I sat on his sofa, surrounded by his half-assembled servers and whiteboards covered in code, and I laid out everything I knew. I didn't cry. My voice didn't even shake. I presented it like a business problem, a hostile takeover of my own life. He listened, his expression hardening with every detail. When I finished, he didn't offer platitudes. He walked to his whiteboard, erased a complex algorithm, and wrote Dominic's name in the center. He drew a circle around it. "Okay," he said. "First, we build a fortress." For the next week, he worked tirelessly. He bought me a new laptop and a new burner phone, taught me about VPNs and encrypted messaging apps. He swept my car and my purse for tracking devices. He was the one who installed the tiny, high-fidelity microphone on my coat, disguised as a designer pin. He became my CTO, my Chief Technology Officer, in the war to come. Looking at my brother then, his face illuminated by the glow of a monitor, I knew I wasn't alone. And that's a feeling that can make all the difference, having that one person in your corner when the world turns against you. My second call was to Victoria. Her name was whispered in the exclusive circles of Seattle's elite. They didn't call her a lawyer, they called her the Valkyrie. A mythic figure you hired when you didn't just want to win a divorce. You wanted to leave your opponent's life in smoldering ruins. Our first meeting was in a discreet office in a downtown skyscraper with a view of Puget Sound. She was in her mid-40s, dressed in a suit so sharp it could cut glass. She listened to my story without a single flicker of emotion, her eyes analytical, assessing. She wasn't judging the pain, she was weighing the assets and the angles of attack. "Most women in your position come to me with tears," she said when I was done. "You've come with a preliminary strategy. Why?" I looked her straight in the eye. "Because my husband sees emotion as a weakness to be exploited. I intend to fight him on the only battlefield he respects, finance and logic." "I'm not here for sympathy, Victoria. I'm here for a weapon." A slow, cold smile spread across her face. "Good," she said. "That I can provide." It was Victoria who brought in Isabel. Where Victoria was a storm, Isabel was the unnerving calm at its center. She was a forensic accountant in her early 40s, a woman who could make spreadsheets sing and bank statements confess. In our first meeting, I handed her the meager evidence I had, the credit card bill and the single-wire transfer statement. She looked at it through her glasses, her finger tracing the transaction number. She was silent for a full 5 minutes. Then she looked up at me, and for the first time, I saw a spark of professional hunger in her eyes. "This transfer," she said softly. "The routing number is for a domestic shell corporation, but the beneficiary address is a P.O. box in Wilmington, Delaware. It's a classic double-blind. He's hiding more, much more. Give me a month." 9 months later, our alliance was forged and battle-tested. We were a silent, efficient machine operating in the shadows of Dominic's gleaming empire. Every lie he told, every dollar he moved, every secret he kept, we documented. He thought he was the master of his universe, a king in his glass castle by the lake. He had no idea the walls were already crumbling from the inside out, brought down by the very woman he thought he'd left powerless in the rain. As Leo's Jeep merged back onto the main road, leaving the desolate rest stop to be swallowed by the storm behind us, the adrenaline of the confrontation began to fade. It was replaced by something colder, heavier. The numbers. In my mind, I saw them not as figures on a spreadsheet, but as bricks in the wall Dominic had been building between us for years. Each dollar he stole was a stone, each secret account a layer of mortar, until he had built an entire fortress of deceit right in the heart of our home. It had all started with Sabrina. The affair itself was almost cliché. I'd seen the way he looked at her during a company party at our house, that proprietary gleam in his eye he usually reserved for a new stock acquisition. The credit card statement was just the confirmation. The real poison was in how he denied it. I confronted him, calmly, with the hotel bill. He laughed. A short, sharp bark of a laugh. "Adriana, you're being paranoid," he'd said, his voice dripping with condescending pity. I was entertaining a client. Sabrina was there to take notes. "Are you really this insecure? My God, I thought you were smarter than this." He was so convincing, so dismissive, that for a fleeting moment I almost believed him. That was his greatest skill, gaslighting. He could look you in the eye while standing in the middle of a fire and tell you the room wasn't hot, and he'd do it with such authority you'd start to question your own scorched skin. The infidelity opened the door, But it was Isabel who walked through it and discovered the palace of lies he'd built on the other side. She started with that first $25,000 transfer to the Delaware Shell Company. For weeks, that was all she had. Then, one Tuesday afternoon, she called me. "I'm in," she said, her voice electric with the thrill of the hunt. The Shell Company wasn't a standalone entity. It was a tributary. Using a series of legal subpoenas Victoria had filed under a vague asset review, Isabel had gained access to its transaction history. It was connected to another company, which was connected to 3 more. It was a complex web of financial entities designed to do one thing: make money disappear in Washington and reappear, clean and untraceable, in Delaware. Over the next few months, Isabel painstakingly mapped out the entire network. The final tally was breathtaking. In just under 2 years, Dominic had systematically siphoned $11.5 million from our joint investment portfolios into 3 master trusts. His plan was clear. By the time he decided to leave me, the marital assets would be a hollowed-out shell, and I'd be left with nothing but legal fees and the memory of a life I thought was mine. He wasn't just stealing money, he was stealing my security and my future. It's a terrifying feeling when you realize the person you trust most is secretly dismantling your safety net piece by piece. But the true scope of his criminality came into view about 4 months ago. Isabel noticed something that didn't add up. The amount of money he was hiding far exceeded what he could have skimmed from our personal accounts alone. His greed had outpaced his means. With my permission, Victoria expanded the legal inquiry to his business, Carter Vance Capital. What Isabel found there turned this from a bitter divorce into a federal crime. Dominic had been running a ghost accounting ledger. For every dollar an investor gave him, he was pocketing 10 cents for himself, routing it through the same labyrinthine network he used to hide our marital assets. The total came to $4.8 million in embezzled funds. This was the moment everything crystallized. My personal pain, my humiliation, it all became secondary. This wasn't just about a cheating husband. This was about a predator. A man who smiled in the faces of his clients while picking their pockets clean. The abandonment on the side of the highway wasn't just an act of marital cruelty. It was the desperate act of a cornered criminal trying to silence the one person who was getting too close to the truth. He thought a little rain and fear would be enough to break me. But seeing those numbers, understanding the depth of his depravity, didn't break me. It forged me into steel. Even with Isabel's map of Dominic's financial underworld, one crucial territory remained unconquered: the Holy Grail. The ghost ledger itself, detailing the $4.8 million he'd embezzled, was not on a company server. Dominic was too arrogant to trust his firm's IT department. Instead, he kept it on a custom-built, military-grade encrypted server in the basement of our home, a black box of digital secrets that he called his personal archive. Isabel had tried every legal angle Victoria could devise, but the server was registered as personal property, shielded from the initial corporate subpoenas. To get a warrant for it, we'd need to present evidence of a crime, but the most damning evidence was locked inside the server itself. It was a perfect, maddening catch-22. We could see the fortress, but the gates were sealed. The 4 of us convened on an encrypted video call one rainy Tuesday night, the mood heavy with frustration. "I'm legally walled off," Victoria stated, her voice sharp and precise. "Any further attempt to access that server through the courts will tip him off, and he'll wipe it clean before we can get near it." Isabel chimed in, her face pale in the monitor's glow. "Everything I have points to that box. It's the heart of his entire operation. Without it, we have a story of a cheating husband who's good at hiding money. With it, we have a federal case." A heavy silence fell over our virtual meeting room. My own heart sank. After months of painstaking work, we were stalled at the 1-yard line. Then Leo, who had been listening silently, leaned into his camera. "We can't break down the door," he said, a glint in his eye. "So we have to get him to open it for us. We need to get him to give us the key." What Leo proposed wasn't a hack. It was a work of art, a piece of sophisticated social engineering that targeted Dominic's 2 greatest weaknesses: his greed and his ego. He called it the honeypot. For the next 2 weeks, Leo and a trusted friend from his old cybersecurity firm worked in secret. They crafted a flawless, fictitious pitch deck for a quantum computing startup, a company so cutting-edge, so revolutionary, it was exactly the kind of ground-floor opportunity Dominic would kill for. Then came the delivery system. Leo identified a legendary, semi-retired Silicon Valley investor whom Dominic idolized but had never met. They meticulously spoofed the investor's email address and crafted a personal note. "Dominic, a trusted colleague mentioned your name. This is an off-the-books look at my next big play. Keep it under wraps. Your eyes only." The pitch deck PDF was the Trojan horse. Embedded within its code was a benign-looking piece of software, a keylogger so advanced it was invisible to any commercial antivirus program. It would lie dormant until one specific application was launched on Dominic's computer, the login client for his personal server. Only then would it awaken and record the keystrokes. The night we sent the email, the tension was unbearable. I paced the floor of my small, secret apartment while Leo watched his monitors from his own command center in Fremont. Hours crawled by. Nothing. Had we misjudged him? Was this the one time his paranoia would outweigh his avarice? At 1:17 a.m., a notification popped up on our encrypted chat. He opened the email. Leo typed. My breath caught in my throat. 10 minutes later, another message. He downloaded the PDF. Then, silence. A long, agonizing 20-minute silence. I imagined Dominic poring over the fake financials, his greed warring with his caution. And then, Leo's final message came through. It was just a single line of text. A password. Master of my universe, 22. The sheer, unadulterated arrogance of it was breathtaking. It's funny how the very thing people use to protect their secrets, a password, can often reveal so much about their ego, about who they believe they are when no one is watching. Leo forwarded the password to Isabel. A minute later, she replied to our group chat. "I'm in," she wrote. My God, it's all here. The final key had turned. The last piece of the puzzle had clicked into place. Now, all we had to do was wait for Dominic to spring the trap on himself. The city lights of Bellevue bled through the rain-streaked windshield, a hazy promise of sanctuary. The worst of the storm was behind us, but inside the Jeep, a different kind of electricity crackled in the air. We had the ghost ledger, the final, irrefutable proof. For 9 months, we had been gathering stones for our slingshot. Now, the giant was in our sights. I took out my burner phone, my fingers steady. All the fear, the doubt, the grief that had haunted me for months had been burned away, leaving only a cold, clear purpose. I sent a new message to Victoria. We have the key. Unlock the gates. Her reply was instantaneous, as if she'd been sitting in the dark, waiting for this very moment. Gates opening at 0800 hours. Godspeed. I could picture her perfectly. Victoria, in her penthouse office overlooking Elliott Bay, wasn't sleeping. She would be standing before a conference table covered not in papers, but in weapons. The emergency petition she had drafted was a masterwork of legal aggression. It was nearly 300 pages long, a meticulous, cross-referenced catalog of Dominic's sins. It contained Isabel's financial diagrams that looked like complex battle plans, transcripts of Dominic's recorded conversations, and a sworn affidavit from me detailing the emotional abuse and the final act of abandonment. Victoria had structured it to request an ex parte temporary restraining order, a legal blitzkrieg. It would allow a judge to freeze every single one of Dominic's assets immediately, without him even being present in the courtroom. The justification was irrefutable. Dominic was a flight risk with access to millions in offshore funds. He was actively dissipating marital assets, and his actions the night before constituted extreme cruelty and spousal abandonment. It was a legal cage, and Victoria was about to slam the door shut. While Victoria prepared for war, Dominic was likely waking up to a victor's peace. I could imagine his morning routine with sickening clarity. He'd rise in our bed, the sheets still holding the scent of my perfume, and walk to the floor to ceiling windows of our Medina lakefront home. He'd look out over the calm water, feeling a surge of satisfaction, picturing me arriving on the doorstep, soaked, humiliated, and ready to beg for forgiveness. He'd pour himself a cup of coffee from the $8,000 espresso machine he'd bought last month, check the pre-market stock futures, and probably send a smug text to Sabrina, something like, "The lesson was administered." He was a king surveying his domain, utterly oblivious to the fact that his entire kingdom was about to be put under siege. The unraveling would have started quietly. Around 9:15 a.m., he might have tried to execute a stock trade to capitalize on some market movement. A small red box would have appeared on his screen. Account restricted. Annoyed, he'd assume it was a technical glitch. Then, perhaps he'd try to use his corporate credit card to book a celebratory dinner with Sabrina at Canlis. Card declined. Now, a flicker of real anger. He would have called his private banker at Goldman Sachs, a man he considered a personal friend, but the banker's tone would have been different, not warm and conspiratorial, but cold and distant. "I'm sorry, Dominic. There's a court order. I can't discuss the details." Court order? The words wouldn't even make sense to him. Then he would have seen the email. The one sent from Victoria's office at 9:01 a.m. The subject line was brutally simple: emergency petition and temporary restraining order. He would have clicked open the 300-page PDF attachment. He would have seen the first page, my sworn affidavit, and then the transcript of our conversation from the night before, his own cruel words staring back at him in cold black type. It's a strange thing about consequences. They can take months, even years to build, but they always arrive in an instant. In that moment, sitting alone in his glass house, surrounded by art he could no longer sell, and cars he could no longer drive, Dominic would finally understand. The woman he abandoned in the storm was the storm all along. While Dominic's world was digitally imploding, mine was being meticulously, theatrically constructed. Leo didn't drive me to the secure, anonymous apartment we had rented months ago. Instead, he navigated the glistening streets of downtown Seattle and pulled up a block away from the opulent entrance of the Four Seasons Hotel. "You ready for this?" he asked, his voice laced with concern. "It's one thing to plan it, it's another to live it." I looked at my reflection in the passenger side window. My hair was plastered to my head, my mascara was artfully smudged beneath my eyes, and my clothes were soaked through. I looked like a woman who had been dragged through hell. "It's just a role, Leo," I said, trying to convince myself as much as him. Showtime. This was Victoria's masterstroke. "He will try to paint you as a cold, calculating, vindictive schemer," she had explained in a strategy session a month prior. "And you are. But the court needs to see something else. We need an impeccable, third-party witness to your trauma. We need to create a narrative, and it needs to be documented the moment it happens." So, the plan was forged. I wasn't just a general leading an army. I had to become my own best piece of evidence. I had to perform the role of the victim so convincingly that it would become an undeniable fact in the hotel's official records. As I stepped out of the Jeep and walked the final block, letting the cold rain seep back into my bones, I shed the skin of Adriana the strategist and donned the tattered persona of Adriana the abandoned wife. I practiced the tremor in my hands, the catch in my voice, the vacant, shell-shocked look in my eyes. It's a strange thing, isn't it, the roles we have to play sometimes? The masks we have to wear not to hide who we are, but to fight for who we want to become. The lobby of the Four Seasons was a different universe. All warm light, polished marble, and the soft scent of expensive flowers. I walked in, leaving a trail of water droplets on the floor, a ghost of the storm outside. Every head turned. I approached the front desk, my hands shaking just enough to be convincing. A young woman with kind eyes and a name tag that read Chloe looked up, her professional smile faltering into a look of genuine alarm. Can I help you, ma'am?" she asked. I let a tear spill over. My husband," I stammered, my voice cracking on cue. "He left me. At a rest stop on the highway. In the storm. He just drove away. I walked for, I don't know how long. A truck driver helped me." Chloe's face went from concern to pure horror. She immediately came from behind the counter, wrapping a plush hotel towel around my shoulders. "Oh my God," she whispered, guiding me to a velvet chair. "You're safe now. We'll take care of you." Everything that happened next was exactly as Victoria had predicted. Chloe brought me hot tea. She documented every word I said in the hotel's official incident report, a report Victoria would subpoena as Exhibit C. When it came time to pay, I pulled out the emergency credit card I'd opened 6 months ago under my maiden name Adriana Rossi, a card Dominic knew nothing about. It was another brick in the wall of evidence, proving his financial isolation and my need to prepare in secret. Alone in the quiet sanctuary of my hotel room, I locked the door and put the chain on. The performance was over. The shaking in my hands ceased. The terror in my eyes was replaced by a hard, crystalline resolve. I walked to the window and looked out at the Seattle skyline, the lights of the city blurred by the relentless rain. I had never felt so utterly divided. I was playing the part of a broken woman, a fragile victim of a cruel man's whim. But as I stood there, watching the storm that mirrored the one I had just unleashed on Dominic's life, I had never felt more powerful, more in control, more myself. A moment later, my burner phone buzzed. It was a text from Victoria. The ice has set. His assets are frozen solid. The first act of my play was a success. Now, it was time for the war to truly begin. The next few days in the hotel suite were a blur of encrypted calls, legal documents, and lukewarm room service coffee. The hotel room was no longer a stage for my performance as a victim. It had become a war room. Victoria's strategy was to move with overwhelming force, burying Dominic in a blizzard of motions and discovery requests before his legal team even had time to find its footing. We were on the offensive, but in the midst of this calculated campaign, a piece of information surfaced that felt less like a strategic asset and more like a personal attack, a blow that came not from the enemy in front of me, but from my own flank. It came during a late-night video call with Isabel. She was sharing her screen, walking me through a newly discovered web of Dominic's slush fund accounts. Her cursor hovered over a single transaction. "This one is an outlier," she said, her brow furrowed in concentration. "Amongst all these payments for luxury goods, gifts for his mistress, and transfers to his offshore trusts, there's this. A $75,000 payment made 3 months ago. The payment wasn't to a jeweler or a car dealership. It was a wire transfer directly to a marker account at the Tulalip Resort Casino. It's the only large payment that doesn't seem to benefit him directly," Isabel continued. I had to pull some strings to see who owned the marker. She clicked open another window, and there, in stark black and white, was the name Laura Rossi, my sister. The air left my lungs. A cold, nauseating dread pooled in my stomach, a feeling far worse than the anger I felt toward Dominic. This was different. This was a betrayal that cut deeper, into the very bedrock of my life. My sister, Laura. She was my older sister, the one who was supposed to protect me. But her life had been a series of bad decisions, fueled by an addiction to the fleeting thrill of the gamble. I'd lost count of the number of times I'd bailed her out, given her loans I knew she'd never repay, covered for her with our parents. I loved her, but it was the weary, fractured love one feels for a beautiful vase that is perpetually cracked. A stranger's betrayal is a wound, but when it comes from your own blood, your own family, that's a poison that seeps right into your soul. I couldn't speak. Isabel, sensing my shock, gently continued. "The payment itself wasn't the goal, Adriana. It was the price. I couldn't understand what information your sister could possibly have that was worth $75,000 to Dominic, so I started digging into your family's history. What she found next shattered my world all over again. My father, a shrewd and quiet man who had passed away 5 years ago, had seen the cracks in Laura long before I was willing to. In his will, he had divided his main assets equally. But secretly, he had established a separate, blind trust in my name alone, with my mother as the trustee. He was a very smart man, Adriana," Isabel said softly. "He hid it to protect you. He knew you'd always feel obligated to help Laura, and he didn't want her addiction to drain your future. The trust was worth $2.5 million, a future my father had secured for me, a future I never even knew existed. And suddenly, the entire ugly mosaic clicked into place. Dominic, in his methodical quest to map out and control every penny associated with me, must have approached Laura. He would have presented himself as a concerned brother-in-law, eager to help. He would have found her at her most desperate, buried under a mountain of debt, and offered her an easy way out. All she had to do was talk. All she had to do was betray a secret her own father had died to protect. Dominic hadn't just stumbled upon this information. He had targeted the weakest person in my life, weaponized her addiction, and turned my own sister into an unwitting spy. The war had just invaded my home, my family, my past, and the victory I was fighting for now felt profoundly, heartbreakingly tarnished. The discovery of my sister's betrayal left me adrift in a sea of cold grief. For 2 days I barely spoke, moving through the motions of the legal battle like an automaton. The strategic thrill was gone, replaced by a hollow ache. Dominic's crimes were a matter of greed and ego, but Laura's felt like a dagger to the heart of our family, twisting a knife in a past I could never reclaim. I was at my lowest point, questioning if the fight was even worth the collateral damage, when a call came from Isabel that changed everything. It wasn't her usual tone, the excited, caffeinated energy of a financial detective on the verge of a breakthrough. This was different. Her voice was low, heavy, as if the words themselves had a physical weight. "Adriana," she said, skipping the pleasantries, "we need to talk. I've traced the primary source of the embezzled $4.8 million. It's not what we thought. We had been operating under the assumption that Dominic was a financial piranha, taking small, untraceable bites from dozens of his wealthy tech mogul clients. It was a cowardly but logical way to steal. What Isabel had uncovered was infinitely more monstrous, more focused, and more revealing of the true darkness in my husband's soul. He wasn't skimming from everyone, Isabel explained, her voice tight with disgust. The vast majority of the funds, at least $1, $2 million of it, came from a single client account. The Puget Sound Veterans Legacy Fund. The name hung in the air between us. My own grandfather had been a Marine who fought in Vietnam. He'd spent his final years in a veterans' home not far from here. The fund wasn't some abstract entity to me. It represented men like him. It was a charity established to provide scholarships for the children of fallen soldiers, to help with medical expenses for wounded warriors, and to offer a safety net for the families who had sacrificed so much. The full depravity of his scheme unfurled as Isabel spoke. 5 years ago, Dominic had made a grand public gesture, announcing that his firm, Carter Vance Capital, would manage the fund's endowment entirely pro bono. He'd received an award from the Chamber of Commerce. There was a picture of him in the Seattle Times, shaking hands with a decorated general, a wolf in sheep's clothing smiling for the cameras. He used this philanthropic facade as a cover. Behind the wall of public goodwill, he had absolute, unchecked control over the fund's finances. He wasn't just a manager, he was a fox guarding the henhouse. And he had been systematically bleeding it dry, transfer by transfer, hiding the theft behind complex investment jargon and falsified performance reports. He wasn't just stealing from a balance sheet. He was stealing from the futures of children who had lost a parent in combat. He was stealing the dignity of men and women who had served their country. Have you ever discovered something so ugly, so profoundly wrong that it changed everything? The moment a personal fight becomes something much, much bigger. That was this moment for me. The grief I felt over Laura's betrayal was instantly cauterized by a white-hot, righteous fury. My pain became insignificant. My personal quest for justice felt selfish and small in comparison. This was no longer my war. I was now a custodian of a much greater fight. The veterans Dominic had defrauded would likely never know the full extent of his crimes. They were names on a list, faceless victims of a man they trusted. I was the only one who could see the whole battlefield. I hung up with Isabel and immediately called Victoria. My voice was no longer weary or grief-stricken. It was cold and sharp as a shard of ice. "Victoria," I said, "change of plans. I don't just want to win this divorce. I want to annihilate him. I want to burn his entire empire to the ground and salt the earth so nothing ever grows there again. Use everything. Hold nothing back." The game had changed, and the stakes were now higher than just my own future. The fire that the Veterans Fund revelation lit inside me burned away all hesitation. My mission was now absolute. But Victoria, ever the pragmatist, brought me back to the cold, hard reality of the courtroom. "This is good," she said during our next strategy call, her voice cutting through my righteous anger. "This elevates the case, but Dominic's lawyers will be sharks. They will paint you as a woman scorned, a vengeful wife, manufacturing a case out of jealousy. They will argue you manipulated the evidence. We need to corroborate the intent to defraud you personally. We need to prove he was actively targeting your assets from the beginning." She paused, letting the weight of her next words sink in. "We need Laura. We need her on the stand." My first instinct was to refuse. The thought of sitting across from my sister, of excavating that raw wound of betrayal, felt impossible. It was a private agony, a family tragedy. To expose it under the harsh, sterile lights of a courtroom felt like a violation. But Victoria's logic was a steel trap. Her testimony will prove he was systemically mapping your finances. It will prove his manipulation. She isn't just a witness, Adriana. She's the living proof of his predatory nature. The choice was brutal. Leave the wound to fester in private and risk weakening our case, or tear it open in public and use the pain as a weapon. For the sake of the veterans, for the sake of every person he had ever harmed, I knew what I had to do. I asked Laura to meet me at a small, unassuming coffee shop tucked away in a corner of Pike Place Market. It was one of the few old places left, a spot we used to go to with our father on rainy Saturday mornings. The air inside smelled of old wood, roasted coffee, and bittersweet memories. She arrived looking like a ghost, her face pale and drawn, her hands trembling as she clutched her purse. She was expecting a storm of accusations, a tidal wave of anger. I decided to give her silence instead. I let her sit, let the tension hang in the air between us, until she couldn't stand it anymore. "Just say it, Audie," she whispered, her eyes pleading. "Just scream at me. Get it over with." I looked at her, my own sister, and felt a profound, weary sadness. "I'm not going to scream, Laura," I said, my voice quiet. "I just want you to see who you were working with." I slid a thin file folder across the table. It didn't contain documents about our father's trust. It contained the bank statements from the Puget Sound Veterans Legacy Fund, with Isabel's neat colored tabs highlighting the dozens of outgoing transfers to Dominic's shell corporations. "He told me he was helping you," she stammered, her eyes scanning the pages. "He said you were under so much stress that he wanted to manage the family money to protect you." "Protect me?" I cut her off, my voice still low but now edged with steel. "He wasn't protecting me, Laura. He was robbing heroes. He was stealing from the families of soldiers. That $75,000 he used to pay off your debts? It probably came from the scholarship fund for a kid whose father died overseas. That's who you helped." The color drained from her face. The self-serving justifications, the narrative of victimhood she had built for herself, crumbled to dust. She saw it. She finally saw the monster she had let into our lives. A choked sob escaped her lips, then another, until she was crying uncontrollably, her shoulders shaking with the full, crushing weight of her guilt. Sometimes the hardest thing in the world is looking at the ugly truth of what we've done. But maybe that's also where the first step toward healing begins. I waited until her sobs subsided. I didn't offer comfort or forgiveness. I offered her a choice. "He used you, Laura. He found your weakest point and exploited it. He did to you what he does to everyone. You can let him get away with it, or you can take your power back. You can stand up in that courtroom and tell everyone exactly what he did to you, to us." Through her tears, she looked up at me, her eyes filled with a pain that mirrored my own. And she nodded. "I'll do it," she whispered. "I'll testify." The broken pieces of our sisterhood had just been reforged into a sword, and it was pointed directly at Dominic's heart. The morning of the emergency hearing, the air in downtown Seattle was crisp and cold. The King County Courthouse stood like a granite monument to order and consequence. Walking through its cavernous marble halls, I felt a strange sense of calm. I was dressed in a sharp, dark gray suit I'd bought for this exact day, a suit Dominic had never seen. I was not the woman he had left in the rain. I was the CEO of his destruction. He was already there, sitting beside a high-priced lawyer who radiated smug confidence. When Dominic saw me, his eyes filled with a mixture of rage and contempt. He still thought he was in control, that this was a messy, emotional spat he could crush with money and legal maneuvering. He had no idea he was walking into an execution. The judge, a woman named Soto, with intelligent eyes that missed nothing, called the court to order. Victoria rose, her presence commanding the room. She didn't begin with bank statements or financial jargon. She began with the human heart of the matter. "Your Honor," she said, her voice clear and steady, "before we delve into the financial details, the court needs to understand the character of the man sitting before you. I would like to play a piece of audio, recorded at 10:14 p.m. on the night of October 12th. She pressed a button on her laptop. And then, the courtroom was filled with the sound of the storm, and Dominic's voice, cold and devoid of any empathy. "Get out. Maybe a 42-mile walk home in a storm will teach you some respect. Teach you your place." A collective, sharp intake of breath swept through the small courtroom. Dominic's face went white, then a deep, mottled red. He stared at me, his expression one of pure, murderous fury. He had been so sure of his power, it never even occurred to him that I could be documenting it. Judge Soto's face remained impassive, but a muscle in her jaw tightened. Victoria let the silence hang for a moment before moving in for the kill. "Now, let's discuss the finances," she said, and with a click, the large screens in the courtroom came to life. What followed was a financial vivisection. Isabel's charts and diagrams filled the screens, a dizzying, undeniable map of Dominic's greed. Victoria walked the judge through the $11.5 million, siphoned into Delaware trusts, the $4.8 million, embezzled from his firm, the damning evidence from the ghost ledger. Dominic's lawyer objected repeatedly. Speculation! Inadmissible! But for every objection, Victoria produced a signed bank transfer, a corporate filing, a piece of irrefutable data. She was dismantling his empire, brick by fraudulent brick. After nearly an hour, Victoria paused. "Your Honor, the evidence clearly shows a pattern of financial abuse and criminal activity, but the defense will claim this is a simple business dispute. We need to establish Mr. Carter's premeditated intent to defraud my client from the beginning." She turned slightly. "The petitioner calls Laura Rossi to the stand." The name dropped like a bomb in the silent room. Dominic's head snapped around. He looked at his lawyer, confused, then back to the courtroom doors. He saw our sister Laura, walking steadily toward the witness stand, and the blood drained from his face. This was a variable he could never have calculated, a betrayal he never anticipated. Laura was sworn in, her hand trembling but her voice clear. Victoria guided her gently. "Miss Rossi, can you tell the court about the conversations you had with Mr. Carter regarding your sister's finances?" Laura took a deep, shuddering breath and looked directly at Dominic. "He told me. He told me he was worried about Audie," she said, her voice cracking. "He said she was fragile, emotionally unstable, and that he needed to protect the family assets from her." The words hung in the air, a perfect, devastating summation of his gaslighting. "And in exchange for this information," Victoria pressed, "did he offer you anything?" Laura's eyes filled with tears. "He paid my debts," she whispered. $75,000. Dominic erupted. "She's lying! This is a setup!" he roared, lunging to his feet before his lawyer could pull him back down. But the damage was done. His violent outburst only served to confirm the very manipulation Laura had just described. There's a terrifying power in speaking a painful truth out loud, isn't there? It can feel like it will break you, but sometimes it's the only thing that can set you, and others, free. Judge Soto's gavel slammed down. The first battle was over, and we had, unequivocally, won. We walked out of the courthouse into the crisp Seattle air, the victory in the hearing feeling like the first real sunshine I'd felt in months. But Victoria tempered our celebration with a dose of cold reality. "That was just the opening battle," she warned, as we navigated through the throng of reporters that had somehow already gathered. "We won the element of surprise. Now he knows he's at war. He'll be cornered, and a cornered animal is the most dangerous." Her words hung in the air as we got into the car. Dominic was legally paralyzed, his assets frozen. But he still had allies, people who depended on his power, people who might be willing to lie for him. And at the top of that list was one name: Sabrina. Up to this point, I had thought of her as a footnote in my story, a symptom of Dominic's deceit. But Victoria saw her as a critical, strategic variable. "She's his greatest vulnerability," Victoria explained. "He's been funding her lifestyle with stolen money. That makes her an accomplice, whether she knew it or not. Right now, she's either going to panic and shred every document she can find, or she's going to panic and look for a life raft. Our job," Victoria decided, "was to provide that life raft, while making it clear the ship she was on was sinking fast. We couldn't approach her directly. That would be witness tampering. So, Victoria did the next best thing. She had a process server deliver a subpoena to Sabrina's luxury South Lake Union apartment, officially summoning her for a deposition as a material witness in the Carter divorce. It was a formal, legal move, but its intent was purely psychological. It was a shot across the bow, a message that her cozy, insulated world was about to be dragged into the harsh light of a legal deposition. I could almost imagine the scene. Sabrina, probably sipping a glass of champagne and scrolling through Instagram, opening the door to a stern-faced man who hands her an official-looking envelope. The legal jargon, the threat of perjury, the realization that her name was now officially tied to this toxic public implosion. The dream life Dominic had sold her, the trips to Paris, the Cartier bracelets, the promises of a future once the crazy wife was out of the picture, would have curdled into a nightmare. It's a harsh lesson to learn when you realize the person you thought was your partner in a grand romance actually saw you as disposable. The moment you stop being useful, you're just another liability. Her first call would have been to Dominic, who would have been unable to do anything, his own lawyers likely advising him to cut her loose. Her second call would have been to a lawyer of her own. And that lawyer would have told her the unvarnished, terrifying truth. She was facing potential conspiracy and fraud charges. Her only way out was to cooperate. 2 days later, Victoria received a call. It wasn't from Sabrina's lawyer. It was from an assistant district attorney for King County. The criminal division had opened a case against Dominic based on the evidence from our hearing, and they had just received a visit from a very cooperative witness. Sabrina had flipped. And she hadn't just come with her testimony, she had brought a treasure trove. She handed over her phone, a device that contained a 2-year-long archive of Dominic's ego, texts where he bragged about outsmarting his dinosaur clients, photos of documents he'd brought home from the office, but the real prize, the nail in his coffin, was something even we hadn't known existed. Fearing Dominic might one day discard her, Sabrina had secretly started recording some of their conversations. On one recording, captured just 3 weeks earlier, Dominic's voice was clear and damning. He laughed as he detailed his plan to leave Adriana with nothing but her ridiculous Stanford MBA, and then, chillingly, he mocked the veterans whose fund he was plundering, calling them a bunch of broken soldiers who wouldn't know a balance sheet from a bedpan. Victoria forwarded the audio file to me. As I listened to the man I once loved mock the very people my grandfather had served with, I knew it was over. His mistress hadn't just left his sinking ship. She had handed the prosecution a torpedo. The 8 months that followed were a grueling marathon of legal procedure. The civil case for my divorce ran in parallel with the federal government's criminal case against Dominic. His high-priced lawyers tried every trick in the book. They filed motions to suppress evidence. They requested endless continuances. They attempted to paint me as an unreliable narrator, and Sabrina as a scorned lover seeking revenge. But the evidence was a mountain, and their efforts were like trying to stop an avalanche with a snow shovel. Finally, the day of his criminal trial arrived. It was no longer a private dispute in a small hearing room. This was a federal courtroom, with a jury of 12 ordinary citizens who would decide his fate. The assistant U.S. attorney, a sharp, no-nonsense man named Mr. Davies, presented the case with brutal efficiency. He didn't just tell a story. He presented a timeline of systematic predation. He put Isabel on the stand, and she calmly walked the jury through the labyrinth of shell corporations, her laser pointer highlighting the direct lines from the Veterans Legacy Fund to Dominic's offshore accounts. He put Leo on the stand, and my brother explained in simple terms how the honeypot trap had worked, proving Dominic's own actions had delivered the final key. The most powerful testimony came from a man named George O'Malley, a retired Army colonel and the chairman of the Veterans Fund. He was 80 years old, with a spine as straight as the day he enlisted, and he spoke with a quiet, heartbreaking dignity about the trust his organization had placed in Dominic. He was a pillar of the community, Colonel O'Malley said, his voice steady. He managed our money for free. We thought he was our benefactor. We never imagined he was our predator. But the final, devastating blow came during the prosecution's closing arguments. Mr. Davies stood before the jury and said, "We have heard testimony about Mr. Carter's actions. Now, I'd like you to hear from the man himself." He played the recording from Sabrina's phone. The courtroom fell silent, and Dominic's voice filled the space, arrogant, smug, and utterly damning. The jury heard him brag about hiding money from his unstable wife. They heard him detail his plans for a new life with Sabrina, and then they heard the final, unforgivable words. They heard him laugh as he mocked the very heroes he was meant to be helping, calling them a bunch of broken soldiers who wouldn't know a balance sheet from a bedpan. I watched the faces of the jury. A woman in the front row, who had been taking meticulous notes, put her pen down. A man in the back, who had a Marine Corps tattoo on his forearm, closed his eyes. In that moment, Dominic was no longer a charismatic financier. He was a ghoul, stripped bare for all to see. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours. When they returned, the foreman, a middle-aged schoolteacher, stood and refused to look at Dominic. He read the verdict, his voice ringing with conviction. On the charge of wire fraud, we, the jury, find the defendant, Dominic Carter, guilty. On the charge of money laundering, we find the defendant, guilty. On the charge of embezzlement, we find the defendant, guilty. On and on it went, a drumbeat of accountability for every single charge. I didn't feel a surge of triumph. I felt a quiet, profound sense of release, as if a weight I had been carrying for years had finally been lifted. They say the wheels of justice turn slowly, but they grind exceedingly fine. It's a powerful thing to witness when all the lies are stripped away and all that's left is the cold, hard truth. At the sentencing hearing 2 weeks later, Judge Soto looked down at Dominic, not with anger, but with a palpable sense of disgust. "You preyed upon the very best of us," she said, her voice echoing in the silent courtroom. "You used your intelligence and privilege not to build, but to destroy, and you did so behind a mask of philanthropy. This court finds your actions to be a profound betrayal of trust that strikes at the very heart of our community." She delivered the sentence without hesitation. "This court sentences you to 144 months 12 years in federal prison." As the marshals moved to cuff him, his eyes found mine across the room. His face was a mask of pure, impotent hatred. I simply held his gaze, my expression calm. There was nothing left to say. He was a ghost from a life that was no longer mine. With Dominic's sentencing, a profound, unnerving quiet settled over my life. The storm had passed, the war was won, and the silence it left behind was deafening. The divorce was finalized in a sterile, anticlimactic proceeding. The Medina lakefront house, a place that had once been my dream home, was sold. I walked through its empty, echoing rooms one last time, the memories now feeling like scenes from a movie about someone else's life. I was financially secure, legally free, and utterly adrift. For nearly a year, my entire existence had been defined by a single, all-consuming mission. Now that it was over, I was faced with a terrifying question. Who was Adriana Rossi now? I spent the next few months trying to find the answer. I traveled, reconnected with old friends, and tried to slip back into the rhythm of a normal life. But something inside me had fundamentally changed. The world of high finance I once inhabited now seemed frivolous. The conversations about stock options and market caps felt meaningless after I had stared into the abyss of true human depravity. The fight had sharpened me, given me a clarity of purpose I'd never known before. Without a battle to wage, I felt purposeless. The answer, the first signpost toward my new future, arrived on a gray Tuesday morning in an official-looking envelope from the U.S. FNX. Securities and Exchange Commission. It was from the SEC's Office of the Whistleblower. I assumed it was a formal letter of acknowledgement. Instead, it was a notification. For providing the initial, critical evidence that led to a major federal investigation and the recovery of millions in defrauded funds, I was entitled to a percentage. I unfolded the enclosed treasury check. The number written on it made me sit down. $1,500,000. I stared at the check for a long time. This wasn't marital property to be divided. It wasn't an inheritance. It felt different. This was justice, quantified and printed on a piece of paper. This money was born from the worst period of my life. It was the direct consequence of Dominic's cruelty and my refusal to be broken by it. And in that moment, I knew with absolute certainty that I could not simply deposit it into my investment account. It was seed money. It was a responsibility. My own battle had been won because I had resources. I had a Stanford MBA. I had a fiercely loyal brother with a genius for technology. I had the means to hire the best legal and financial minds in the city. But as I sat there, I thought of all the women who didn't. The women trapped in financially abusive relationships, their confidence eroded, their bank accounts secretly drained, their futures being stolen right under their noses. The women who were being told they were crazy, paranoid, and bad with money, while their partners systematically dismantled their lives. They didn't have a Leo, a Victoria, or an Isabel. They had no one. It's amazing how sometimes the greatest pain in your life can leave behind a blueprint for your greatest purpose. The scars become the map that shows you where to go next. The idea began to take shape, not as a business plan, but as a moral imperative. I picked up my phone. My first call was to Leo, my second to Victoria, my third to Isabel. I didn't offer them jobs. I offered them a mission. I'm starting a nonprofit, I explained. A foundation to provide pro bono, financial, legal, and technological support for victims of domestic financial abuse. I'm using the SEC reward to fund it. I chose a name, the Athena Foundation, after the goddess of wisdom, courage, and most importantly, strategy. 2 weeks later, the four of us stood in a dusty, empty loft space in Seattle's historic Pioneer Square. The paint was peeling, and the floorboards creaked, but the large windows let in the afternoon light. It was a blank canvas. I unrolled a set of architectural plans on a makeshift table. "This is where we build the armory," I said. "This is where we forge the weapons for the women who need them most." The phoenix was finally rising from the ashes. A year can change everything. The once empty loft in Pioneer Square was now the headquarters of the Athena Foundation, and it was alive with a quiet, determined energy. We had transformed the space not into a corporate office, but into a sanctuary. The security was state-of-the-art, designed by Leo to be a digital and physical fortress for our clients. The atmosphere was calm, the walls painted in soft, soothing colors, the air filled with the scent of coffee, and the low hum of people working to reclaim their lives. Our mission had become our daily reality. On any given Tuesday, you could walk in and see Isabel in a private consultation room, sitting with a woman who looked terrified, gently guiding her through bank statements and showing her the hidden credit card accounts her husband had opened in her name. In the conference room, Victoria, the fearsome Valkyrie of the courtroom, would be running a legal clinic, explaining financial rights to a group of women in plain, empowering language. And in what we called the tech bunker, Leo would be patiently teaching a client how to sweep her phone for spyware, his voice calm and reassuring as he helped her sever the digital chains that her abuser had used to control her. My own role had shifted. I was the founder and the strategist, but more than that, I had become a custodian of stories. I sat with our clients, listened to their accounts of betrayal and manipulation, and in their frightened eyes, I saw a reflection of the woman I once was. I didn't share all the details of my war with Dominic, but I shared the feelings, the creeping dread, the gaslighting that made you question your own sanity, the terror of realizing your home was not a safe harbor but a gilded cage. I let them know they were not alone, that their fight was not impossible. We were providing the weapons and the armor, but the courage to fight was theirs alone, and it was a privilege to witness it every day. But as the foundation grew, a nagging feeling began to settle in my heart. We were defensive. We were helping women escape and rebuild, but we weren't addressing the specific wound that had started it all. We were reacting to the damage, not creating something new in its place. The thought crystallized during a quarterly board meeting with Leo, Victoria, and Isabel. As we reviewed our successful cases and our budget, I knew something was missing. "We're doing incredible work," I began, "but our mission is incomplete. We are fighting the consequences of Dominic's greed. I want to actively reverse the damage he did. I want to build a legacy that will mock the memory of his crimes." I then proposed a new, second pillar for our foundation. I wanted to allocate 30% of our annual budget to create a new initiative, the Legacy Tech Scholarship. There's punishment, and then there's justice. And maybe true justice isn't just about tearing something down, it's about building something better and stronger in the empty space that's left behind. I explained my vision. The scholarship would be exclusively for the children and grandchildren of veterans from the Puget Sound region, designed to fund their university degrees in science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. The symbolism was the point. Dominic, a man who built his empire on technology and finance, had used his power to steal from the pasts of these families. We would now use the proceeds of his downfall to invest in their futures, using the very fields he had corrupted. We would transform his act of theft into an act of creation. It was the ultimate poetic justice. Victoria, Isabel, and Leo looked at me, and I saw not just agreement in their eyes, but a shared, fierce pride. The vote was unanimous. 2 months later, we awarded our first full scholarship. The recipient was the granddaughter of Colonel George O'Malley, the brave man who had testified at the trial. She was going to the University of Washington to study cybersecurity. As I signed the scholarship check, I felt a sense of peace that had eluded me since the day Dominic was sentenced. We were no longer just fighting his shadow, we were planting trees in it. 2 years passed. The Athena Foundation grew from a fledgling idea into a respected institution. We helped over 100 women find their footing, untangle their finances, and escape the invisible prisons of abuse. My life found a new rhythm, one defined not by crisis and conflict, but by purpose and quiet progress. The memories of Dominic, the trial, and the night in the storm had receded, becoming a part of my history, the foundation upon which my new life was built, but no longer the house I lived in. Then, one afternoon, a letter arrived. The envelope was cheap, the address written in a familiar, perfect script. The postmark was from a federal correctional facility in Oregon. It was from Dominic. My hand trembled slightly as I held it. It felt like a relic from a buried tomb, an artifact I had no desire to excavate. Part of me wanted to throw it straight into the shredder. But another part, the part that needed to see the story through to its absolute end, compelled me to open it. The letter was 4 pages long. It was not an apology. It was a monument to his own delusion. It was a rambling, self-pitying manifesto of blame. He accused me of orchestrating his downfall from the day we met. He claimed I had been jealous of his success and had meticulously plotted to destroy him. He showed not a flicker of remorse for the veterans he'd robbed or the lives he'd ruined. His only regret was getting caught. The words were filled with the same narcissistic rage I'd seen in the courtroom. He was a man still trapped in the prison of his own ego, rattling the bars of a cage he himself had built. The final line, scrawled at the bottom of the last page, was almost laughable in its complete lack of self-awareness. It read, "After all this, I truly hope you've finally learned your lesson." A few years ago, those words would have wounded me. Now, I just felt a profound, bottomless pity for him. He was still fighting the same old war, while I had moved on to build a new world. I didn't shred the letter. Instead, the next day, I took it to a professional framer. I had it mounted in a simple, elegant black frame and hung it on the wall of my office. It hangs there today, right between my MBA from Stanford and the charter for the Athena Foundation. It's a strange triptych, a symbol of my education, a symbol of my legacy, and a symbol of the poison that created the need for both. New clients sometimes ask about it, confused by the angry scrawl in such a place of honor. I always tell them the truth. It's from the man who inspired all of this, I say. He wrote that he hoped I'd learned my lesson. And I did. Just not the one he intended to teach. Isn't it powerful how we can reframe the things meant to hurt us, to take a curse and turn it into a creed to live by? I learned that when someone shows you their true nature through their cruelty, you must believe them the first time and act accordingly. I learned that the intellect, the education, and the strategic mind he tried so hard to belittle were, in fact, my sharpest and most reliable weapons. But the most important lesson was this: the greatest victory isn't watching your enemy crumble. The greatest victory is in what you build afterwards. The best response to someone who tries to break you is not just to become unbreakable, but to use your newfound strength to reinforce the foundations of everyone around you. As I look out my office window now, at the steady, purposeful pulse of the city of Seattle, I think about that phrase he spat at me in the rain. Know your place. He was right. I do know my place. My place is not 42 miles from home, abandoned in a storm. My place is here, in the heart of this city, in a building dedicated to justice, surrounded by warriors, helping other women find their own place in the world. The rain is falling again tonight in Seattle, a soft, steady drumming against the windows of my apartment. It's a different kind of rain now. It no longer sounds like an assault. It sounds like a cleansing. It's the sound of a city washing itself clean, preparing for a new day. The war is a distant echo, a story I tell myself and others, not to relive the pain, but to remember the lessons forged in that fire. The Athena Foundation has become my life's work, a living testament to the idea that from the deepest betrayals, the most profound purpose can grow. Sometimes, late at night, I think of that woman standing on the side of a highway, soaked to the bone, watching a pair of taillights disappear. I don't feel pity for her. I feel a quiet, fierce pride. She was not a victim. She was a seed, dormant and buried, waiting for a storm to break the ground open so she could finally grow. Dominic thought he was abandoning me in the darkness, leaving me powerless. He never understood that he was actually leaving me in the fertile soil of my own untapped strength. He was the catalyst, the cruel force of nature, that, in trying to destroy me, forced me to become something more powerful than he could ever imagine. He tried to teach me a lesson about my place in the world, and in the end, he did. My place is not to be a quiet passenger in someone else's story. My place is to be the author of my own, and to help as many women as I can find the strength to write theirs.